The South Side of Chicago had always known how to host community events that felt more like reunions. No velvet ropes, no egos. Just folding chairs, steam rising from chafing dishes, and the low hum of laughter between music speakers that crackled from age. Inside the Madison Community Center, people gathered for the annual back-to-school tech giveaway. The center had seen sponsors come and go, but this year, whispers spread like wildfire. Someone special was coming, not a rapper, not a celebrity, a businessman, a billionaire, the kind that usually stayed far from these streets. He wasn't pushed in. He wasn't wheeled in. He walked, slowly, deliberately, a cane in his right hand, his left clasped tightly with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4. A mirror of him, coyly dark curls, alert eyes, the same dimple. On his other side, another girl, her twin in every way but expression. While the first smiled wide, this one clung to his arm, shy but curious. The crowd parted as if the floor had shifted beneath them. No bodyguards, no entourage, just a man, walking on legs that doctors once said wouldn't hold his weight again. A woman near the snack table dropped her paper plate. Her hand flew to her chest. "Is that him?" Her voice cracked, full of disbelief. "Is that Frank Phillips?" People didn't know whether to cheer, cry, or stare, but he didn't flinch. He stopped beside a group of kids marveling at the brand-new laptops, bent down slowly. Whispered something to one girl who had her hair styled in colourful beads. She giggled and hugged him. It was the kind of scene nobody expected from a man who used to own boardrooms, not community rooms. But even more shocking was who stood at the back of the room. Frozen, breathless, Sandra. Her knees weakened, her lips parted, but no words came, because there he was. Her husband, with their daughters, walking like he'd never been broken. From across the room, Sandra's chest rose and fell like she'd run miles. There was no warning. No call ahead, no heads up that he'd be here, at this community center, where she had built a quiet life away from the storm. Her hands trembled. He looked so whole, confident. He still carried a slight limp, but there was pride in his posture. His frame had filled out again. His eyes, once sunken in pain, now glowed with warmth as he knelt to tie one of the twins' shoes. And just like that, everything she had buried resurfaced. The long nights of therapy, the guilt of leaving, the love that had never really stopped burning. She had told herself 1,000 times, he was better off without her, because she hadn't left out of pride. She left to protect, to shield her daughters from media vultures, to give him space to rebuild without the shadow of obligation, to survive. Because what do you do when you fall in love with a man the world pities, and the moment he begins to heal, you realize you're pregnant? What do you do when you know the world will say you trapped him? What do you do when you've finally helped someone stand again, but fear your presence will only pull him back down? Not because you don't love him, but because you love him too much to stay, so you vanish. You carry the weight of secrets and carry twins in your belly. You raise them quietly, give them joy, and try to convince yourself they'll be enough. But that ache in your chest, it never really leaves. And now, here he is, with them, like destiny gave him back to you, at the exact moment you had finally stopped hoping. Frank Phillips had been declared a case study in what tragedy does to powerful men. After the accident, the media labeled him reclusive. His board called him detached. His mother? She pitied him but used his condition to tighten her grip. The world had moved on. But inside that man was a battle most people never saw, the kind that wasn't fought in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in bedrooms where painkillers sat untouched beside untouched food. He didn't just lose the ability to walk, he lost the will to feel. He couldn't sleep, couldn't pray, couldn't picture a future that wasn't stuck in replay. Doctors gave up on his legs, his ex-fiancée gave up on his soul. Even his own reflection felt like a stranger. Until Sandra. She wasn't part of the plan. She wasn't the woman anyone would have chosen for him. But she came with softness when the world only gave sharp edges. She showed up with healing in her hands, stories in her laughter, and a love that didn't flinch at his scars. And from that love, miracles happened. He laughed again. He stood again. He fell in love, not like in movies, but in the quiet way a man begins to breathe without choking. But when she left without a trace, he stopped breathing again. So how do you heal from a second kind of loss? You don't. You just survive. Until one day, two little girls grab your fingers like they've always known you and call you home without saying a word. What happens when the man who was once broken becomes whole, not through surgery, not through money, but through the love of a woman the world dismissed? What if the same woman everyone underestimated becomes the reason two children now smile without fear? And what happens when that man, who once needed a cane to move, now runs toward his future, carrying the names of daughters he never even knew he had? Zila, Zara, his girls, his heart, his family. The story you're about to hear isn't about wealth, power, or revenge. It's about how love, real love, doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Hey family, before we dive deeper, please like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Mr. Victor Storytime. Every click helps us share more unforgettable stories like this one with the world. Let's grow this storytelling family together, because what you're about to witness isn't just about healing, it's about how one woman, soft-spoken, underestimated, and full of quiet fire, helped a man walk again and made him a father of two. Let's go back to the beginning. Before headlines ever called him a tech genius, before his name became synonymous with innovation, Frank Phillips was just a man who believed in discipline, structure, and quiet ambition. By the age of 34, he'd built one of the most powerful AI development firms in Chicago. Not with scandal or showmanship, but through sleepless nights, impossible deadlines, and an obsession with excellence. He didn't throw parties, he made moves. And while most billionaires lived loud, Frank thrived in silence. But silence took on a different meaning after the crash. One rainy evening, on the interstate just outside Oak Brook, Frank's world turned upside down, literally. His car, hit from the side by a driver he once called a friend, flipped 3 times before, slamming into a guardrail. By the time paramedics pulled him from the wreckage, his spine had suffered trauma doctors warned might be permanent. When he woke up in a hospital bed, unable to move his legs, it wasn't pain that hit first. It was disbelief. And when the pain finally did come, it came in waves that didn't stop with medicine. His recovery was long, brutal, isolating. But the cruelest part, it wasn't the physical loss, it was emotional abandonment. His fiancée at the time, Melissa, stood by his bedside only once before telling him through clenched teeth, "You're not the man I fell in love with. I didn't sign up to be a caretaker." She left the next morning. No note, no goodbye. Just the echo of stilettos fading down the hospital hallway. Frank didn't cry. He stopped talking instead. He built walls so high even his own mother couldn't scale them. He returned to his penthouse, moved only by schedule and obligation. No color, no music, no laughter, just glass, chrome, and a man in a chair who no longer saw the point. Love, dead. Hope, dormant. Life, tolerated. Across the city, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side, Sandra wiped sweat from her forehead as she folded her mother's laundry. She had just finished her 3rd shift in 2 days, juggling housekeeping at a private residence and helping at the hospital where her mother received treatment. Bills were piling up like unread prayers. Still, Sandra smiled when her mother cracked jokes about Sunday meals and teased her about settling down. That was the kind of woman Sandra was, holding joy in one hand, heartbreak in the other. She grew up with block parties, praise dance teams, and neighbors who treated each other like blood. Even in the struggle there was rhythm, gospel music in the mornings, kids knocking for sugar, and aunties loud with laughter under sun-worn porches. But none of that stopped the weight she carried. Her mother's condition had worsened, insurance had run out, and Sandra, despite being smart, ambitious and kind, found herself backed into corners most people never recover from. She took shifts no one wanted. She ate less so her mother could eat more. She sold personal items to pay for ride shares to and from the hospital. The one thing she never sold? Her dignity. She had dreams once, becoming a physical therapist, starting a wellness clinic in the neighborhood, but life put those on hold. Still, she never hardened. She held the elevator for strangers. She called older neighbors to check on them. And in every patient she helped roll into surgery or into rehab, she gave a bit of herself. It was that heart that caught the attention of someone unexpected. Mrs. Eleanor Phillips wasn't the nurturing type. She believed in legacy, image, and the power of appearances. Her son's accident, though tragic, had become a blemish on what she called the family brand. His absence from society events, his refusal to smile on magazine covers, it all grated her nerves. So when doctors said Frank might never walk again, she didn't grieve. She strategized. She wanted him married, not loved, settled, not healed. She wanted someone who'd play the part of devoted wife while keeping the media quiet. And during a hospital visit to a friend, she noticed Sandra pushing an elderly woman down the hallway with unusual care. Sandra's voice was soft, eyes alert, hands steady. She didn't just assist, she comforted. Mrs. Phillips followed her discreetly, observed, asked around, single, no children, working multiple jobs, financial stress obvious. In her eyes, Sandra was perfect, not because she was exceptional, but because she needed something badly enough not to argue. So the invitation came in an envelope delivered by private car. Sandra almost didn't open it, but she did. She read the terms once, then twice. We are offering you a legal marriage to Frank Phillips. In return, you will receive full medical support for your mother, clearance of all outstanding debts, and a financial cushion to begin your own life once the contract ends. No romantic obligation required, just presence, support, and discretion. It didn't feel like a proposal. It felt like a lifeline, laced with chains. Sandra sat by her mother's bedside for 2 days, the offer folded in her pocket like a secret. I don't want you giving up your life for this family, her mother said weakly, sensing the burden on her daughter's shoulders. I'm not, Sandra whispered back. I'm just making a different kind of investment. She didn't see it as selling herself. She saw it as stepping into a role the world wouldn't understand, but one her heart had the capacity to handle. No one would suffer for her pride. No hospital would turn her mother away again. If being Frank Phillips' wife, on paper, meant saving someone she loved, then she would do it with her chin up, her back straight, and her eyes open. She signed the papers in a quiet office, her fingers trembling only slightly. There were no flowers, no celebrations, only ink, silence, and terms that felt too formal to be called a union. When Sandra arrived at Frank's mansion, the sky was overcast, matching the mood of the estate. The front door opened to a hallway of white marble, glass railings and cold air conditioning that chilled more than just her skin. She was led to his suite by an assistant who didn't speak much. Frank sat by the window, back straight, hands folded, eyes distant. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't smile. He didn't ask her name. You're the woman my mother hired, he said flatly. Sandra stood still. I'm Sandra, she said softly, not flinching. I don't care who you are, he said. Just stay out of my way. Do your part. I'll do mine. Her heart dropped, but she didn't run. Instead, she walked into the room, placed her suitcase down and said, I'm not here to fix you, Frank, but I'm not here to break either. He blinked, slowly turning toward her. Their eyes met, for just a second, but the chill between them didn't thaw. Not yet. They were strangers, bound by circumstance. The legal marriage happened the next day. No kiss, no exchange of vows, no cake, no music, just signatures. But that night, as Sandra unpacked in the guest room, she made a vow to herself, one she whispered into the darkness. Even if he never learns to love me, I will not lose myself in this mansion. And so it began. Not with passion, not with hope, but with quiet defiance, and the first brick of something neither of them could see yet. The front gates groaned open, but no one came to welcome her. The mansion towered like a quiet judge. White stone, symmetrical windows, tall hedges groomed into unnatural silence. A chauffeur placed her single suitcase beside her, nodded, and drove off. The silence that followed was heavier than traffic noise. A staff member opened the door wordlessly, gestured her in, then disappeared. No introductions, no warmth. Sandra stepped inside and met the chill. Marble floors stretched like museum displays, a staircase with steel rails curled upward like a question mark. The walls bore abstract art, cold swirls of grey and blue. There were no photographs, no signs that people actually lived here. Just wealth. She could hear the echo of her own footsteps as she was led down the hall. Guest room, kitchen schedule, quiet hours, staff boundaries, all delivered in clipped tones by a woman in a grey uniform who seemed more robotic than human. When Sandra asked where Frank was, the woman replied, "He's unavailable. Unspoken message. You're not important enough." Sandra nodded silently. She hadn't come here for a grand welcome. But still, something about this place made her feel like a vase placed where it wouldn't be knocked over. Not seen, not valued, just kept. That night she unpacked in the guest room and pulled the covers tight around herself. In a house big enough to fit 3 families, she had never felt more alone. The next morning, Sandra prepared a simple breakfast and brought it to Frank's suite. He was awake, seated in his wheelchair, back turned to her, staring out the glass wall that overlooked the city skyline. His room was sharp, everything black, silver, or white. Not a single soft surface in sight. She cleared her throat gently. "I brought you something to eat." No response, just toast and tea. "I didn't know what you liked, but—" "You don't have to guess," he cut in, voice low and flat. "There's a kitchen staff for that." Sandra set the tray down anyway. "I just thought, that's the problem. You're here to stay out of the way. This isn't your home. Don't make it one." His words were like frost, but Sandra didn't flinch. She simply nodded, backing out of the room. "We will not share meals. We will not speak unless necessary. You will attend public events only when scheduled. Please do not attempt to form a friendship." She read it twice, folded it once, then placed it in the drawer beside her bed and whispered to herself, "Noted." But she didn't cry, because she hadn't come here to beg for warmth. She had come to honor a contract and find her own sense of purpose inside a house that seemed allergic to joy. The first change was a small potted plant, a jade vine, set quietly on the foyer table near the front entrance. The staff didn't remove it. They weren't sure if Frank had ordered it. A week later, fresh sunflowers appeared in the dining room, then cinnamon on the kitchen stove. Sandra didn't rearrange the mansion. She softened it. She replaced the sterile soap in the guest bathroom with lavender. Left a folded quilt in the downstairs reading nook, moved a family-sized board game set onto the coffee table, not expecting anyone to touch it, but hoping someone might. She never made grand announcements. She simply acted like a person who believed a home should feel lived in, even if she was the only one doing the living. And the food? She cooked on Sundays. Nothing elaborate, just dishes that reminded her of her mother. Baked tilapia with garlic and herbs, cornbread with a touch of honey, rice and beans with roasted plantains. The staff noticed. At first they stayed away, but one by one they began peeking in. An assistant asked for a recipe. The security guard nodded in thanks. The housekeeper lingered longer in the kitchen. And when Sandra asked if she could plant herbs in the side garden, no one said no, not even Frank. Weeks passed. Frank still didn't speak to her unless necessary, but something in the house had changed. The kitchen had laughter now, small, hesitant, but real. The hallways didn't echo as sharply. One of the housekeepers started leaving friendly sticky notes on Sandra's door. Even the air smelled different, like sage and something almost close to cinnamon toast. Sandra didn't pretend the mansion was warm yet, but she knew cold. She had grown up in winters with broken heaters and learned how to find heat in her own hands. She didn't wait for Frank's approval. She read books in the garden. She played soft jazz in the mornings. She danced when no one was watching. She watered every single plant herself. Not to be noticed, but because she refused to let the mansion define her mood. And quietly, room by room, the house began to shift. Frank noticed the changes before he admitted he did. The first thing he clocked was the scent, earthy, fresh, not the sterile cleaning product his staff had used for years. Then the color, a throw blanket here. A subtle painting framed above the entry bench. None of it was loud, but it clashed beautifully with the cold perfection his mother preferred. He watched from his room camera feed sometimes. Her in the garden, her humming in the kitchen, her teaching one of the younger staff how to fold linen with crisp corners. She was everywhere, and yet never overbearing. She kept her distance, but she stayed present. It confused him. He had expected someone who would try to fix him, someone who would hover, someone who'd eventually leave like all the rest. But she didn't. She just existed, gently. That, more than anything, was what unsettled him. And one evening, when he rolled past the study and caught the faint scent of something sweet from the oven, he paused, just long enough to listen to her laugh through the wall. He didn't smile, but he didn't close his door either. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sandra's family arrived. They came in a small convoy of beat-up sedans, minivans, and a single rental SUV with a speaker system in the back playing classic R&B. The mansion gates opened slower than expected, as if confused by the wave of energy rolling in. Out stepped aunties with foil pans and cousins in oversized hoodies. Uncles wore wide smiles and cologne that hit before they even rang the bell. Little kids tumbled out with beaded braids, juice pouches, and stories to tell, even before their feet hit the marble floors. Sandra met them at the front door with a soft grin and a nervous tug of her cardigan. "You sure this rich man gonna survive all this joy in one house?" Her cousin Kenya teased, swinging a bag of dominoes over her shoulder. "I'm sure," Sandra replied, though she wasn't. Not entirely. She wasn't sure how Frank would react. But she wasn't about to let that stop her from bringing a piece of her life into the cold space she lived in. The dining room was transformed in less than an hour. Long tables of home-cooked food, jollof rice, fried chicken, collard greens, mac and cheese with the crispy cheese edge, pound cake, peach cobbler, and Kool-Aid in a glass pitcher. The house staff watched, wide-eyed. Sandra's family greeted them like long-lost cousins. Nobody cared about boundaries. That night the mansion sounded different, like a block party had tiptoed in and sat down for dinner. Frank didn't come out of his room at first, but he heard it. He heard life. Frank sat in his chair by the window, motionless, but not unaffected. He'd caught the scent long before the sound reached his hallway. Spices, onions, chicken that didn't come from a sterile plated tray. Laughter followed, not the polite kind his mother's friends offered at galas, real, unfiltered joy that carried from belly to ceiling. He checked the hallway monitor on his tablet. The screen blinked to reveal people he didn't recognize, some dancing, some hugging, all living. There was no approval form for this. No please reply, just people. Walking freely through a mansion that had known only hushed tones and dress codes. He stayed hidden, but he watched. And for a moment, he didn't feel like the CEO who had lost everything. He felt like the version of himself he used to be, the kid who snuck late-night burgers with his college roommate, the man who used to host low-key poker nights before the cameras came. It was the first time in years that the noise didn't hurt his head. It soothed him, and when he saw Sandra, laughing with her aunt, wiping her niece's face, helping her uncle with the grill tongs he'd insisted on bringing indoors, something unfamiliar tugged at his chest. He wasn't ready to call it comfort, but he didn't shut the door. That night, Frank dreamt of simpler days, not dreams with beaches or wine glasses, but ones with slow mornings, unshaved faces, and coffee brewed too strong. He saw himself in his old walk-up apartment before the world demanded more from him than he knew how to give. He remembered the first woman he ever loved. Not Melissa, long before her. She'd made him waffles on a thrifted waffle iron and sang 90s ballads while brushing her hair. They'd broken up because of careers, not cruelty. Back when love still made sense. When Frank awoke, the mansion felt too quiet again. Sandra's family had left in the night, but their spirit lingered. He rolled past the living room and saw a card taped to the fridge. "You got a good one in Sandra. Treat her right." Cousin D. Frank stared at it for a long time. No one had ever left him a note that simple. Not his colleagues. Not his board. Not even Melissa. He plucked it down, folded it gently, and placed it in the side drawer of his study. He didn't know why, but something about it felt worth keeping. 2 days later, Eleanor Phillips arrived unannounced. She walked in like she still owned the place, leather gloves on, pearls tight, perfume sharp. "Where's the girl?" she asked her son barely, hiding the sneer. Frank, seated calmly with a book open on his lap, didn't respond. He didn't have to. Voices echoed from the parlor room. Eleanor had brought 2 friends, socialites who believed their wealth made them wise. They spoke in loud whispers over cocktails. "She's charming, I'll give her that, but a bit too familiar for a Phillips bride. Did you hear her family brought food? As if this was a block picnic. Honestly, it's generous of Eleanor to take her in. Poor girl must have never even seen granite counters before." Sandra stood at the edge of the hallway. She heard every word. She didn't flinch. She walked past them politely, a gentle smile on her face. One of the women paused, clearly uncomfortable being caught. Sandra said nothing. She just adjusted the vase of fresh lilies on the hallway table and walked into the kitchen, humming quietly to herself. Frank found her later that night in the garden. She was on her knees, repotting basil with her hands covered in soil. No makeup, no mask, just Sandra, in her own rhythm. "Why didn't you say anything to them?" he asked softly. She didn't look up. "They already decided who I am," she said. "Words won't change that." He stepped closer, cane in hand. "They embarrassed you." "They embarrassed themselves," she replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "I came here to help you. Not to fight for approval from people who'll never bother to see me." Her words weren't bitter. They were just real. Frank watched her for a long time. That grace she moved with, it wasn't performance, it was power. She had every right to defend herself. But she chose dignity, and something about that shattered his last excuse. For the first time in months, he said the words aloud. "Thank you. For staying." Sandra looked up, lips parted slightly in surprise. But she didn't push. She just nodded and went back to planting. And for the first time, Frank didn't feel like the only human in his home. He felt seen. Chicago storms had a way of swallowing a house whole, and that night the mansion felt smaller than ever. Wind slammed against the tall windows. Rain hammered the roof with a force that made the lights flicker. Thunder rolled like heavy boots across the sky. Even the plants in the foyer trembled. Sandra had just finished washing dishes from her quiet evening meal when a violent crack of thunder shook the house deeply enough to rattle the pots on the counter. She froze. Not because she feared storms. She'd grown up with windows rattling in her childhood apartment. She feared what storms did to him. Frank hadn't spoken much that day. He'd stayed in his room, retreating to that world behind glass where he thought no one could see him, but Sandra had noticed the stiffness in his shoulders. She'd noticed his breathing, shallower than usual. She'd noticed the way he avoided looking outside once the clouds rolled in. Another crash, this time louder. The entire house trembled. Sandra dried her hands quickly and listened. She didn't hear footsteps, but she felt something wrong, a heaviness in the air, a disturbance. As if the house itself was trying to tell her to check on him. She hurried down the hallway, her bare feet whispering across the polished floor. When she reached his door, she didn't knock. She pushed it open quietly. What she saw tightened every muscle in her chest. Frank was slumped beside his bed, half on the floor, half supported by his wheelchair frame. His hands clutched his temples. His breathing was broken, fast, uneven. His body shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. His eyes were open, but he wasn't really seeing the room. He was seeing something else, something he'd never escaped, the crash. "Frank," Sandra whispered, stepping closer. "Can you hear me?" Another thunderclap split the sky. He flinched so hard his cane fell beside him. His chest rose and fell too quickly. His hands gripped the carpet, as if he were trying to hold onto something that kept slipping away. "No, no, no, please." His voice cracked, low and strangled. The words weren't meant for her. They were meant for the past. For the moment metal twisted. For the second betrayal turned into broken glass. Sandra lowered herself gently beside him. "Frank," she said again, softer this time. "You're here. You're safe. You're not alone." He didn't answer. His breathing worsened, quick, shallow, panicked. His eyes squeezed shut as if the storm outside was replaying the worst seconds of his life. She'd seen panic in patients before, but not like this, not from a man who fought so hard to hide everything human about himself. Slowly, carefully, Sandra reached for his hands. He jerked away at first. Then another thunder strike shook him so deeply he didn't resist when she guided his hands into hers. "You're not on the road," she whispered, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "You're in your room, in your home. Breathe with me. Just breathe." He tried. Failed. Tried again. Sandra cupped the back of his neck gently, grounding him. "Look at me," she murmured. His gaze lifted, disoriented, painful, raw. And for the first time, she saw the depth of his fear. He wasn't the cold billionaire tonight. He wasn't the man who barked orders or hid behind silence. He was a man who had been broken in a way he never allowed the world to witness. And he couldn't lift himself out of it alone. Sandra tightened her grip on his hands. "I'm not going anywhere," she assured him. The storm outside continued. But inside the room, something else began. Minutes passed, slow, uneven, then steadier. Sandra kept guiding his breath, out, out. Her presence was gentle but firm, like a person holding a rope for someone trapped in deep water. His trembling eased, his shoulders lowered, his eyes, still glassy with past memories, began searching the present. "You're safe," Sandra whispered again. "I'm right here." He swallowed, his throat tight. His voice broke. It felt like I was back there. "You're not," she said. "You're with me." Another rumble rolled through the sky. Frank flinched, but this time his hands stayed in hers, not gripping, not fighting, just holding. And it was more than he had been given in years. His breathing steadied further. The tension in his frame softened. He finally let his head fall forward, resting on her shoulder, not out of choice, but surrender. Didn't comment. Didn't take advantage of the moment. She simply supported him, her presence warm against the cold floor, a kindness he couldn't explain, a safety he didn't know he needed. The mansion, usually void of feeling, now held a moment so sincere it almost hummed in the air. And for the first time, Frank didn't run from it. When the worst of the storm quieted, gentle rain tapping the windows instead of shaking them, Frank finally lifted his head. His eyes were rimmed red, not from tears, but from exhaustion. "Don't," he muttered softly as if embarrassed. "Don't what?" Sandra asked. "Don't look at me like this." "How am I looking at you?" Her response was calm. "You needed someone," she said. "Not a savior, just someone." His jaw tightened, not from anger, but from an emotion he didn't recognize anymore. When she reached for his cane, he placed a hand over hers. "Stay," he said quietly. She froze, not because of the request, but because of the tone. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't commanding. It was a whisper of truth, heavy with years of suffering he had never spoken aloud. And she meant it. Frank nodded once, as if accepting something he'd denied for too long. That he wasn't as alone as he pretended. That he didn't have to carry the storm by himself. That someone in this house saw him, fully, and didn't look away. They sat together on the floor for a long time, quiet, breathing, letting the storm fade outside and inside. No speeches, no apologies. Just silence that didn't hurt anymore. Eventually, Sandra helped him stand and ease into his chair. She tucked a blanket over his lap, not because he needed warmth, but because she sensed he needed grounding. Before leaving, she hesitated at the doorway. "Frank," she said softly. He looked up. "You're allowed to feel," she told him. "You don't have to fight everything alone." But when he did, his words were low, an admission pulled from a place he had buried. Sandra nodded gently. "I did." He held her gaze longer than he ever had before. "Just possibility." Sandra stepped out, closing the door halfway. Frank stared at the spot where she had knelt beside him. His heartbeat, steady now, felt different. Not healed, not whole, but open. Something permanent had changed in the space between them. He didn't know its name yet, but he knew this. The storm had taken something from him years ago. Tonight, Sandra had returned a piece of it. The next morning, the storm had passed. But something between Frank and Sandra had shifted like the air after lightning. Charged but calm. She found him at breakfast, sitting by the window with a blanket still draped over his knees. He didn't look up when she entered, but his voice was softer. "Thank you." Last night, she didn't press, just poured tea and sat across from him. A few minutes passed in silence before she spoke. "I want to try something." He raised an eyebrow, cautious. "I learned a few things while taking care of my mom. She had a stroke, couldn't walk for nearly a year. We couldn't afford private therapists, so I studied. Nutrition, muscle stimulation, movement patterns. Things not every hospital takes seriously." Frank didn't respond right away. Sandra leaned in gently. "No needles, no pressure, but I'd like to help if you'll let me." He stared at her hands, small, steady, warm against the cold ceramic cup. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but fear. "I've had a dozen specialists," he said. "None of them worked." "I'm not a specialist," she replied. "Just someone who won't stop trying." That hit differently. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no, and that was enough. They began in the mornings, not in his therapy room, but in the quiet sitting area that overlooked the back garden. Sandra brought a thick mat, a towel, and a folded sheet of notes she'd written over the years. Frank wore sweatpants for the first time since the accident. She noticed, he noticed her noticing, and ignored it. Sandra moved slowly, explaining every step before touching him. "I'm going to rotate your ankle first, just follow the motion." He nodded once, barely. She began. Her hands were confident, not clinical. She talked while she worked, not about his condition but about memories, her mother's stubbornness, her cousin who refused to drink water, the time a squirrel broke into her childhood apartment. Frank listened, not because he had to, but because it distracted him from how vulnerable he felt. It wasn't just the exercises, it was the intimacy of being touched without pity, the softness of her presence, the steadiness of her tone. Sandra adjusted his position with care, never rushing. She didn't try to fix him. She simply treated him like a person, not a project, and each time she finished a session, she said the same thing. "Same time tomorrow?" Eventually, he started answering with a real yes. By the third week, something unexpected happened. Frank laughed, not a sarcastic smirk, not a dry chuckle. A real laugh, warm and full, from deep inside his chest. It happened when Sandra told him about the time she tried to follow a yoga YouTube video and fell face first into a laundry basket. He lost it. "Wait, you landed in the basket?" he asked between laughs. "Fully, legs in the air. I nearly folded myself, even the staff in the hallway paused when they heard it. That sound hadn't echoed through the house in over 2 years. Sandra didn't make a big deal of it. She just grinned and continued massaging his knee joint. But Frank? He blinked a few times afterward, like the laughter surprised him as much as it did everyone else. That night, he looked at himself in the mirror longer than usual. But something was different. He didn't know what to call it. But it wasn't hopelessness anymore. One morning, Sandra entered the room with her usual energy, only to find Frank already seated on the mat, waiting. "You're early," she teased. He shrugged. "Didn't feel like staring at the wall today." They went through the stretches, the pressure work, the slow reflex exercises. She noticed how he held his posture better now, how his arms steadied himself more naturally. They took a break midway, and she left to grab water. When she returned, "You okay?" He nodded quickly. "Fine." Sandra tilted her head. "You sure?" "I said I'm fine." He avoided her gaze, adjusting his position awkwardly, but the way he pressed his foot into the mat. Frank locked the door that night. Then, slowly, he leaned forward in the chair, placed his hand on his thigh, and concentrated, just like before. The same pressure points Sandra had been working on. Not out loud, but in the way his whole body froze in disbelief. His leg had moved. He covered his mouth, tears threatening. But he didn't cry. He sat back, breathing hard. The next day, Sandra noticed something subtle. Frank sat taller, his shoulders squared with less tension. She didn't ask. But during one of the exercises, she applied light pressure to the bottom of his foot, and his knee reacted. She paused. He stiffened. She met his eyes. They both knew. He expected her to explode with excitement, but she didn't. Instead, she smiled, gently. "You're doing well," she said softly, brushing her hand down his arm. "Keep showing up like this." He couldn't speak, because he realized something deeper. She had seen the miracle, and chose not to make it about her. She gave him the space to own it. And somehow, that made it mean even more. That night, as Frank sat alone in his room, staring out over the city lights, he whispered one word. "Maybe." He didn't finish the sentence, but for the first time since the accident, he meant every part of it. 3 months. That's how long they had been working together. Daily stretches, massages, focused breathing, upper body strengthening, laughter that became routine, and stories Sandra told to fill the silence that once ruled his days. Frank had become someone else, not fully, not loudly, but in subtle ways. He slept better, he read more, he remembered what his own voice sounded like when used for something other than commands. Sandra began bringing a different tea blend each week, hibiscus, lemon balm, peppermint, and with each flavor came a new story. Frank listened. Sometimes he'd even respond with something personal, something real. They no longer kept distance. She no longer asked for permission to adjust his posture. He no longer kept his arms crossed when she spoke. Progress didn't come in bursts. It came like a drip, but the container had slowly filled, and deep inside, Frank had been preparing for the moment he hadn't dared hope for, preparing to reclaim something no surgeon could give him back. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise, when the house was still quiet and the sky was soft. Sandra had gone to the kitchen to grab a warm compress. Frank sat alone on the therapy mat near the garden doors, staring at the patch of morning light that stretched across the tile, his palms pressed flat on the mat. He leaned forward, tension in his shoulders. His legs, though weak, had not felt this alive in years. 1, 2, 3. And slowly, deliberately, he pushed, his knees bent, his back tensed, both feet flat, knees trembling. His hands reached out and grabbed the side table for balance, but he was up, standing, real, vertical, breathing. And just as he began to sway, a voice froze him in place. "Frank?" Sandra stood at the entry of the room, compress still in her hand. Her mouth dropped. The warmth in her eyes collided with disbelief. Tears rimmed her lashes before either of them realized. He looked at her, exposed, shaking, barely able to hold himself up. But standing. "I didn't mean for you to see this yet," he whispered. She stepped forward slowly, hand to her chest. He swallowed hard. "We did this." Later that day, Frank sat on the edge of his bed, cane in hand. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't high-tech, it was a simple wooden cane, one Sandra had bought weeks ago, quietly placed in his room and never mentioned. "I kept it near just in case," she said gently. "Not to rush you." He held it like it was more than a tool, like it was a symbol. With her help, he stood again. He took one step, then another, each one shaky but his. The staff noticed first. The whispers started. The cook gasped and dropped a spoon. The housekeeper wiped her eyes. A security guard clapped without realizing it. Sandra stayed quiet. She let Frank have the moment. In the evening, he walked the length of the hallway near the gallery wall. She followed at a distance, not guiding, just there. He paused beside the mirror, looked at himself, not the man in the chair, but in that house, on that night, it felt louder than anything money had ever bought. A few nights later, after dinner, the house was quiet again. Sandra hummed softly as she cleaned up dishes. A soft soul song played on the speaker in the background. Frank appeared in the hallway, leaning gently on his cane. "You always hum that tune," he said. She turned, surprised. Frank stared at it like it was foreign, then placed his hand in hers. They didn't dance in the ballroom. They danced in the hallway, slow, wobbly, hesitant, but intentional. Sandra placed her other hand on his shoulder, guiding them gently. He let out a quiet breath. "This is ridiculous," he murmured. She smiled. "Then why aren't you letting go?" He didn't answer. Because for the first time in forever, he didn't want to let go of anything that felt this alive. Their steps weren't coordinated, but the feeling, it was synchronized. They started staying up late after their sessions. No screens, no staff. Just soft lamplight and open hearts. Sandra would curl up on the reading nook while Frank sat on the couch, Kane resting beside him. They talked about everything. She told him about her first heartbreak, a boy who promised forever and vanished after a family move. Frank told her about the one time he got caught sneaking into a lecture hall to sleep after working 3 days straight. They laughed. They paused. They filled silences with honesty instead of awkwardness. One night Frank asked, "Do you miss home?" Sandra nodded. "Every day. Then why stay here? Because something about this place, about you, tells me not to leave just yet." He didn't ask her to explain. He just listened, and in that listening, a new thread of connection pulled tighter between them. Not duty, not obligation, just understanding. The next morning, as they stood near the window watching sunlight pour into the garden, Frank reached for her hand. No announcement, no hesitation. Sandra looked at him. Her fingers curled into his. There was nothing grand about the gesture, but it felt like the first brick of something steady. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Every second," he replied. "But not of you." She smiled. They stood like that for a while, fingers interlaced, heartbeat calm. a silence that didn't ask for more. It eased through the cracks, and in that house, once sterile, once cold, it had finally begun to bloom, not because of obligation, but because two broken people had chosen to meet each other at eye level. One step, one story, one shared breath at a time. Frank didn't fall for Sandra the way he once thought love worked. There was no racing pulse or dizzy infatuation. No butterflies, no clichés. It was quieter. It was the way she folded the laundry with care, even his clothes. It was the way she kept tea ready at exactly the temperature he liked. The way she left space for him, not to be rescued, but to be real. He noticed it one morning as he walked past the open kitchen door. She was dancing, barefoot, to an old gospel tune, swaying softly while stirring a pot. She hadn't noticed him. And he stood there, cane in hand, just watching. He didn't think about her being his wife by contract. He didn't think about what his board would say or what the papers would spin. He just thought, she feels like peace. That night, he sat up late just to hear her humming in the hallway again. Sandra introduced Frank to her world in pieces. Not in lectures or speeches, but in experiences. She made him try a goosey soup. He winced at the texture and she teased him for days. She pulled him into family Zoom calls, where her cousins made fun of his polished shirts and asked if he could play spades. He couldn't, but he tried. She showed him how to wrap sweet potatoes in foil and place them straight on the fire pit. He told her about venture capital while she painted her nails. She made him watch reruns of sitcoms he never knew existed. They laughed until he had to hold his ribs. In return, he invited her into parts of his world he'd never shared before, not even with Melissa. He let her into his office while he worked. He told her about the startup days, the risks, the failures no one wrote about. He let her sit in his quiet. Not as a guest, but as someone who belonged there. They learned to live around each other, then with each other. And somehow, between inside jokes and shared silence, love made its way in. It was well after midnight when Sandra returned from visiting her mother. The sky was dark, the house was quiet. She entered through the back kitchen door, toed off her shoes, and turned the corner, and gasped. Frank stood at the other end of the hallway, no cane, no hand on the wall. He walked, fully, balanced, determined, toward her, slow but steady, each step intentional. Sandra's breath caught. Her bag slid from her shoulder to the floor. Frank stopped just 2 feet from her. He paused, his voice tight with emotion. I wanted my first full walk to be toward you. Couldn't. Her hands trembled, tears welled, and when he reached for her face, she leaned into his palm like it was the most natural place in the world. You did it, she whispered. We did, he replied. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't about chemistry or release. It was about trust. It started as a breath, then a touch, then a gentle meeting of lips that spoke more than words could capture. It was respect. It was two people finally allowing their hearts to say what their mouths had held back. Sandra rested her hands on his chest, steadying herself. Frank pulled back just slightly, enough to meet her eyes. No contracts, he said. No expectations, she replied. They smiled, foreheads touching. In that moment, nothing about them felt arranged. The next morning, Eleanor Phillips arrived with tailored purpose. She walked into the kitchen, coat still on, nostrils flared. The butler didn't have time to announce her before she caught sight of Sandra and Frank seated together, her hand resting gently on his thigh. Eleanor's heels clicked louder with each step. I see your little arrangement has taken a turn, she said, voice sharp. Frank stood. No cane, no hesitation. You're not welcome to speak to her like that. Eleanor blinked. Excuse me? She's my wife, and not just in name anymore. Sandra didn't flinch. Eleanor turned her attention to her. You think a few meals and sob stories make you worthy of the Phillips name? No, Sandra said calmly. But love does. Frank stepped between them, his voice low but unshakable. This house is hers too now. If you can't accept that, you're the one who doesn't belong. Silence. Eleanor's lips tightened, but she didn't argue. She turned and walked out. But before the door shut behind her, she spoke one final line over her shoulder. This won't end the way you think. And then she was gone. But Frank didn't chase after her. He turned to Sandra. I don't care how it ends, he said. I only care about where it begins, with you. And this time she didn't let go. The morning she left was quiet. No warning, no bags by the door, no slammed cabinets, no open drawers. Frank had woken late, stretching his arms without needing to brace himself on anything. He walked past the empty guest room, now Sandra's sanctuary, and paused. The bed was made, the lamp was off, the quilt she loved was folded neatly. At first he thought she had gone to the garden. But the garden was still, no sandals on the porch, no watering can tipped beside the tomatoes. He checked the kitchen, no simmering pot, no humming, no trace of her tea on the counter. 3. No text, no call. He asked the staff. No one had seen her leave. She hadn't driven, hadn't taken anything but a small handbag and a folded photo of her mother tucked into her coat pocket. Frank's hands trembled as he checked every room twice. Sandra was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. And the house felt colder than it had ever been, even when he couldn't walk. Frank's first reaction wasn't grief, it was disbelief. He called her phone, straight to voicemail. He called her mother. No answer. He asked the staff again. This time more firmly. He reviewed the security footage. She had walked out at 4:12 a.m., coat on, face calm, eyes distant. He called his legal team. Terminate the marriage contract, he said. I don't care about the terms. He fired 3 members of the household staff within 2 days, not because they did anything wrong, but because their presence reminded him of her. He cancelled a major tech conference appearance, pulled out of a board summit, and shut down his schedule for the next month. People asked questions. He gave no answers. He stayed in his office, didn't sleep, didn't eat much. He didn't cry. He just folded, the way people do when the one person who helped them stand disappears without reason. Months turned into years. Frank built a new public image, philanthropic, forward-facing, emotionally mature. He walked unaided now, wore tailored suits again, smiled when cameras flashed, but the smile never touched his eyes. His board praised his recovery. His company stock soared. Magazine covers called him the comeback icon. No one knew that at night he still sat in the garden she once touched, that he kept her mug in the cupboard, that he never replaced her quilt on the couch. He poured millions into youth tech programs, not because he believed in charity, but because he hoped doing good might quiet the ache inside. Nothing did. The staff stopped mentioning her. Her scent had faded from the house, but her memory lived in the quiet. The silence was no longer healing. It was a wound that never scarred over. And every time he felt even a sliver of joy, he wondered if she was out there, feeling anything close to it. Frank walked into a new project launch gala with grace, posture, and composure. He gave a heartfelt speech about legacy and hope. He shook hands with donors, posed for pictures with college students, and wrote a $2.5 million check to fund a tech training hub in the South Side. He looked the part, played the part, lived the lie. Later that week, he visited one of the completed centers on 79th Street, humble brick-walled, filled with laughter and mismatched chairs. He wore jeans, no suit, no press. He walked into a classroom full of young students being taught how to build apps. A boy in the front row asked, "Are you the rich guy who paid for this?" Frank laughed softly. Something like that. He stayed for 2 hours, signed laptops, gave tips, encouraged kids who reminded him of versions of himself. When he finally made his way to the community room to drop off some gift boxes, he froze. Because at the far end of the room, passing juice to a group of small kids seated on the floor, was her. Sandra stood in soft denim and a burgundy cardigan, hair pulled back loosely. She hadn't seen him yet. She knelt beside a girl in braids, helping her unwrap a sandwich. Then she turned. Her eyes locked with Frank's. The world fell away. No words, no movement. Just that frozen, breathless space between disbelief and truth. Twins, one with a gap-toothed grin, the other with Sandra's eyes, and his chin. Frank couldn't breathe. His legs didn't fail him, but his heart stuttered. Sandra blinked once, lips parting, hands trembling. She knew this moment would come. She just didn't know it would feel like this. Frank took a step forward. One child peered up at him curiously, the other tilted her head, cautious. They didn't know who he was. But he knew exactly who they were, and everything he'd buried for 2 years surged forward in a tidal wave of ache, love, confusion, and need. He whispered her name. She whispered his. And finally, the silence between them was broken, not by confrontation, but by truth waiting to be told. The room around Frank blurred. Kids' laughter faded into silence. The clatter of juice boxes and folding chairs dissolved. Even the smell of crayons felt far away. All he could see were the 2 little girls clinging to Sandra's legs. One wore pink sneakers and a bright yellow headband. The other held a tiny notebook decorated with glitter stickers. They turned toward him at the same time. 2 small faces, 2 pairs of wide brown eyes. But the shape, the tilt of their lids, and the realization sank deeper than any wound he had ever carried. His breath hitched. His knees nearly buckled. Sandra's lips parted, eyes glossy, hands shaking. She stepped forward slightly, instinctively shielding the girls, but not hiding them. She knew she couldn't. Not anymore. Frank took a slow breath, grounding himself against the storm inside his chest. "Sandra," he whispered, voice cracking. She swallowed. "I didn't expect you to see them like this." He blinked. "Hard. Those are—" She nodded before he could finish. "Yes," she whispered. "They're yours." The words didn't just land. They lifted something inside him he had buried for 2 long years. Sandra motioned for the girls to join the group of volunteers setting up story time in the corner. They obeyed, but kept glancing back at their mother, and at the tall man staring at them like they held the sky. When they were out of earshot, Sandra exhaled deeply. Her hands trembled. Her voice was soft. "I left because I found out I was pregnant the week after Eleanor threatened to have me removed from your life for good." Frank stiffened. His jaw clenched. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What did she say?" Sandra held his gaze. "That I didn't belong. That marrying you was a mistake she intended to correct. That if I stayed long enough to cause trouble, she would make sure my life became unlivable." Frank looked ready to break something. "She did this?" His voice deepened. "She's the reason you left." "She wasn't the only reason," Sandra admitted. "When I found out it was twins, I knew what it meant. They'd grow up in a world that would judge them. Judge me. Judge you." He shook his head slowly, his eyes burning. "You think I would have let anyone hurt you, or them?" "I didn't want them growing up as a scandal," Sandra whispered. "I didn't want people assuming I trapped you. I didn't want your mother turning them into something to hide." Her voice cracked. "And I didn't want them to see you broken all over again because of me." Frank's breath released in a shudder. "You protected them," he murmured. "By breaking me." Tears slid down Sandra's cheeks. I thought you'd move on. Heal. Build a life without the weight of us." "I healed enough to walk," he said quietly, "but never enough to forget you." A volunteer brought the children back for snack time. They stood shyly beside Sandra, peeking at Frank from behind her legs. Sandra wiped her face quickly before kneeling to their height. "Girls," she said gently, "this is Frank. He's someone very important." The twins looked up at him, curious, cautious, hopeful. Frank lowered himself slowly, knees bending with effort he didn't care about right now, until he was eye level with them. He managed a small smile. "Hi," he whispered. "My name is Frank." The girl with the yellow headband tilted her head. "You walk like Mommy." Sandra let out a soft gasp. Frank laughed, choked, emotional but real. "I do," he said. "Because she helped me." Frank blinked. "Stories?" "Mommy said you helped people. Mommy said you were sad. Mommy said you made her heart warm." "Zila," Sandra whispered to the first. "Zara," she said toward the second. Frank smiled through watery eyes. "So those are your names?" The twins nodded. He raised a trembling hand, not touching, just offering the gesture. "Can I—" Both girls reached out instinctively. One took his hand, the other touched his wrist. No fear, only recognition written in their small faces. Something in him collapsed quietly. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their first birthdays. But right now he was here, and they accepted him without hesitation. Frank sat back on his heels, breathing unevenly. Zila pressed her palm against his cheek. "Why are your eyes shiny?" He smiled shakily. "Because I'm happy." Zara climbed onto his knee like she'd done it her whole life. "Did you know about us?" Frank's throat closed. "No," he whispered. "But I should have—" Sandra looked down, guilt tightening her face. The girls didn't feel the tension. They simply leaned into him, one on each side, tiny arms wrapping around his shoulders. Frank froze, then hugged them back, carefully, reverently, like they were made of something precious, not loudly, not dramatically, just silently, a father holding daughters he never had the chance to love until now. His tears touched Zila's curls. Zara patted his cheek with her little hand. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're here." He nodded slowly. "I see that," he whispered. "And I'm not letting go." When the girls ran off to play, Frank stood slowly and faced Sandra. The room felt smaller now, not because of tension, but because of truth that had finally surfaced. Sandra wiped her eyes again, but it didn't stop the tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought giving you distance would protect you." Frank stepped forward. "You didn't just protect me," he said gently. "You gave me more than I ever believed I'd have again." He reached out, touched her face. "No therapist, no doctor, no treatment did for me what you did. You healed me in places I didn't know were broken." She lowered her head. He lifted her chin. "And then, you gave me them." Her breath caught. He pulled her forward. Sandra fell into his embrace with a trembling exhale, and his arms wrapped around her like he'd been waiting years to hold her again. He whispered into her hair. "You didn't just walk away with my heart, Sandra. You walked away with my future." She clutched him tighter. "I was scared," she breathed. "I'm scared too," he admitted, "but I'm done losing you." They stood like that, two people stitched back together by truth, guilt, forgiveness, and two small girls with matching eyes. Only one question remained. The office that once felt like Frank's fortress now seemed like a gilded cage. He stood by the glass wall overlooking Manhattan one last time. His fingers gently touched the edge of the mahogany desk that bore witness to his rise, his pain, and his rebirth. But he wasn't that man anymore. Sandra changed everything, he whispered to himself. The final board meeting wasn't about numbers or metrics, it was about legacy. Frank announced his departure as CEO, not in shame or defeat, but in peace. There were murmurs, shock even, but nobody challenged him. Not after all he'd survived. "I will remain a silent partner, but it's time I live for more than profit margins," he said. The decision shocked the press. Headlines buzzed for weeks, but Frank didn't care to read a single one. He was done living for applause from people who didn't know his scars. Now, he was ready to live quietly, purposefully, with the woman who had redefined love and the daughters who had given him a new reason to wake up every day. That evening, he walked into their apartment, where the girls were building cardboard castles in the living room, and Sandra was dancing with flour on her cheeks, baking banana bread. "Daddy's home!" Nella and Zila screamed in unison, rushing toward him. He knelt, catching both into his arms, and whispered, "Home is wherever you three are." And that was the first day of the life he never knew he needed. They left Manhattan behind like a chapter closed with a deep exhale. Frank didn't want skyscrapers or limousines anymore. He wanted community, family, the simplicity of sunrise coffee on a porch with laughter instead of quarterly reports. He bought a cozy two-story home in a quiet Maryland neighborhood, not far from Sandra's mother. It had a wraparound porch, a garden out back, and a creaky screen door that squealed just the way a home should. Sandra was stunned when they pulled into the driveway. You bought this?" Frank grinned. No more penthouse elevators, just a place to breathe and live. Inside, the walls were painted warm earth tones. Frank had chosen the home himself, down to the tiniest detail. He even had the girls' names etched into wooden stools by the kitchen island. The first night, Sandra's mother came over with plantains and okra soup. She was skeptical of Frank, still testing if his change was real. But when she saw him wash the girls' hands, kiss his wife's forehead without spectacle, and sit on the floor to help Zila tie her shoelaces, her heart softened. "I never thought I'd see the day," she murmured to Sandra in the kitchen. "I didn't either," Sandra whispered back, smiling through quiet tears. Weekends became a mosaic of joy and laughter. Saturday mornings, Sandra's mom taught the girls how to cook. Little Zila insisted on adding too much pepper, while Nella tried to perfect the rice-to-water ratio, like it was a science project. They danced to Afrobeat as they stirred the pot, laughing at their own messes. Grandma said, "If your jollof doesn't cause a food coma, you did it wrong." Nella said proudly, holding up a spoon for Frank to taste. He chuckled, wincing from the spice. It tastes like ambition and fire. But Sunday afternoons were Frank's domain. The garage was turned into a mini tech lab. He introduced the girls to basic coding through games, animations, and storytelling. They learned how to build characters that moved, drew digital rainbows, and programmed puzzles. "You're creating things from nothing," Frank told them. "That's magic." Zila asked one day, "Daddy, were you always this happy?" He paused. "No, sweetheart. I had to meet your mom, and you too, before I really knew what happiness meant." Their family wasn't just blending food or skills. It was blending souls, dreams, and identities. They didn't just teach each other, they became each other. One afternoon, Frank came home holding a flyer for a local youth tech initiative. "They need volunteers," he said, eyes hopeful. Sandra wiped her hands on a towel. "You want me to teach coding? No. I want you to show them the strength of a woman who loved when it was hardest, who stayed even when I couldn't walk. That kind of power rewires people's beliefs more than any machine." They joined together, hosting community tech expos, fundraisers for single mothers in tech programs, and workshops for underrepresented youth. Sandra's voice soon became sought after. Her warmth, her story, her unfiltered truth, it resonated. She told young girls, "Your strength is not in silence or survival. It's in showing up for yourself, even when no one claps." Frank watched from the sidelines, beaming. Not with pride as a husband who'd transformed her, but with humility as a man who had been saved by her. Their love expanded outward. It touched strangers, it ignited hope in communities, and through every hand they held, every story they heard, they grew even closer. Love wasn't just in the kisses anymore. It was in the causes they fought for, together. Evenings in their new home were slow. No more gala invitations, no boardroom drama, just quiet music playing in the background as Sandra folded laundry and Frank read bedtime stories with funny voices. They'd lie in bed sometimes and just talk, not about the past but about dreams. Not about regrets, but about the joy in hearing their daughters snore across the hallway. One night, Sandra whispered, "You're different, Frank." He turned to face her. "I had to become the man worthy of your love. I couldn't let that chair define me. And now, I walk, not just with legs, but with purpose." Sandra reached for his hand. "You don't have to prove anything to me anymore. Just be." Their intimacy was no longer wild with urgency or brokenness. It was a deep exhale. Soft touches, forehead kisses, a new kind of fire, burning gently, beautifully, enduringly. Frank no longer feared the darkness or silence, because every moment with her was light. It was on a Sunday morning, as the family picked oranges from the backyard tree. Frank reached into his pocket. "I never imagined this kind of love." He got down on one knee. Zila dropped her orange. Nella squealed. Sandra froze. No contracts, no pressure. "Just this," he said, holding up a handcrafted ring with their daughter's birthstones embedded. "I'm already your wife," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I never asked you with my heart. Sandra, will you marry me again? Not because I needed saving, but because I finally know how to love the right way." Her yes wasn't loud. It was whispered between a kiss, sealed with the laughter of their daughters and the wind swaying the backyard trees. This time, it wasn't about healing pain. It was about building forever. The park was alive with the sound of laughter, birdsong, and the soft rhythm of sneakers on morning grass. It was a warm Sunday, the kind that wrapped around the soul like a familiar song. Zila and Zara, now 5 years old, ran through the open field with giggles trailing behind them like ribbons. Sandra sat on the bench, her eyes following the twins like a compass that never lost direction. Her braided hair was pinned back under a wide straw hat, and her sundress fluttered in the breeze. She looked peaceful, rooted. Beside her, Frank Phillips, former wheelchair-bound billionaire, now fully healed, had one hand resting on her back and the other, balancing a small cooler packed with sandwiches and juice boxes. Families strolled past, some with strollers, others walking dogs. The world had kept spinning, but for them, time had found its sweet spot. This morning was simple, but it was sacred. Zara chased a butterfly while Zila called out, "Mama, look at me run," and she did. Sandra never missed a moment. because she had once thought she'd lose everything before she had the chance to live like this. Frank gently squeezed her shoulder. Want to walk around a little? Let's wait till they burn out that energy first, she smiled, watching the twins twirl. Frank chuckled. At this rate, they'll outpace me by lunchtime. You're not doing bad yourself, she teased, leaning into him. They watched, heart soft, eyes quiet. Under a shaded pavilion nearby, a folding table was set up. On it were dozens of brown paper bags, each neatly folded and labelled. Apple slices, sandwiches, and juice packs had all been prepared at dawn, like clockwork. It was their Sunday ritual now. Frank handed Sandra another roll of paper towels to wipe down the final few lunchboxes. This one's for Malik, she said, slipping in a fruit cup. He doesn't like turkey, so I made him egg salad. You remember every kid's preference? Frank asked, genuinely impressed. I remember how it felt when people didn't notice what you liked. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her, looked at the woman who had changed his entire life. The foundation Frank had launched, the Phillips Circle for Healing, had grown. It now supported programs for children who lost parents, women rebuilding after hardship, and rehabilitative therapy services. But what he loved most wasn't the gala events or corporate updates. It was this. Sundays in the park, serving kids, laughing beside Sandra, seeing joy that couldn't be bought. She handed him the last lunch. You ready to hand these out, CEO Daddy? He smiled. Lead the way, First Lady of the Park. After the lunches had been handed out, and every small thank you hug had melted into the background, Frank and Sandra returned to their favourite spot, a tall oak tree with roots old enough to remember when cities were quiet. They spread out a blanket, sat side by side, and simply watched. Zila was helping another little girl tie her shoelaces. Zara was giving away her juice box. The kindness their daughters showed wasn't taught, it was lived. Sandra reached into the tote bag and pulled out a notebook. She had been journaling lately. About gratitude, about becoming. Frank leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. You wrote, Frank taught me how to love gently. That's something, he said softly. You taught me love doesn't have to hurt, she replied. He took a deep breath, resting his hand over hers. There was nothing loud about this life now, no boardroom chaos, no public image to control, just the quiet assurance that even the most broken beginnings could lead to beauty. And all of it, every piece of it, had come from healing forward, not backward. The sun filtered through the branches, painting them in soft gold. The warmth didn't just sit on their skin, it settled inside them. Sandra leaned her head on Frank's shoulder, eyes closed. He didn't move. I used to pray, she whispered, not for wealth, not even for happiness, just for peace, for someone who would never see me as a burden. Frank tilted his head toward hers. You were never a burden. You were a bridge to a life I didn't think I deserved, he answered. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full. You could have given up on love, she whispered. I almost did, he admitted, but then you told me something that ruined that plan forever. You told me love doesn't demand perfection, it just requires presence. Sandra chuckled softly. I sound like a wise woman. You are, he grinned, but don't let it go to your head. They sat like that for a long time, two imperfect people, holding space for the grace that had found them. Zila tripped and fell into the grass. Before Sandra could rise, Frank had already jumped up, not limping, not pausing. He ran to her, not fast, but steady. Confident. With every step, the past felt farther and farther away. He scooped Zila into his arms, checked her scraped knee, kissed her forehead, and let her know she was safe. She was always safe now. When he came back, Sandra looked at him like he was walking on clouds. Did you ever think this would be your life? She asked gently. Frank glanced at the ground, then at the girls, then finally at her. No, he said honestly. I couldn't even walk. Now I run after miracles. Sandra's eyes welled up, but she didn't let the tears fall. She smiled, full and sure. Miracles, she repeated. Yes, he said, cupping her cheek. And you were the first one. The twins ran toward them, arms wide, legs pumping with joy, laughter flying behind them. Mommy, Daddy, Zara shouted. They collided into Sandra and Frank's laps, tumbling over with pure delight. Frank held one in each arm, while Sandra kissed their curly heads. In that moment, the chaos of the world paused. They were just a family, whole, healed, here. No media, no fortune talk, no whisper of a painful past, just love, real and grounded. And as the camera of life zoomed out, the final frame was clear. 4 souls under a tree, 2 parents who had walked through fire, 2 children who would never know what it meant to be unloved. Frank closed his eyes and held them tighter. The story wasn't just about healing anymore, it was about what love could build after the scars. If this story touched your heart, comment "Miracles Happen" and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Mr. Victor Storytime. Let's keep telling stories that heal.